Good day and welcome back to the Vitality Project. I'm Dr. Bob. I want to thank you for joining me here today. Yesterday we actually spoke two different languages, and they're both ancient languages. We brought two ancient languages together, specifically ancient Chinese, where we were referring to the philosopher 500 years before Christ, Lao Tzu. And we were combining him with looking at how the ancient Greek roots of the Christian New Testament supplied us with some new insights into this idea of missing the mark. Before I talk about that, I want to say this, as odd as it may appear at first, where you bring in ancient languages like we did, it can actually provide useful foundations for us if we can step back from the canvas of our one way of understanding things, for example, using contemporary language to express ourselves. And if we can gain a new perspective by combining old languages with the new. Yesterday it was ancient Chinese and ancient Greek with contemporary English. Well, what we can do is maybe bring what's familiar with us into conversation with what's less familiar. And for you to know, this is the very definition of personal creativity, is bringing two things together into the same space that haven't quite been brought together that way before. So I hope that you joined me in the exercise, which was an exercise in creativity. How did it go for you? I asked you to reflect on a time where you missed the mark. Recall that we were looking at a poem from Lao Tzu where he talked about missing the mark. And we also connected this to the ancient Greek idea of missing the mark. The ancient Greek word was hamartia, which is translated in the New Testament as sin, missing the mark. Well, how did it go when I asked you to reflect on a time, not just when you missed the mark, but also when you were able to correct having missed the mark and get back on target? I want you to know that the reason I gave you this exercise is that this particular realization is absolutely essential. And let me tell you why. When we make a mistake, as long as we can keep clear and not mix up the doer of the deed, the doer, when we mix it up with the doer, that's ourselves, that's what psychology refers to as shame. And we lose track then, or lose sight of the deed that can be corrected. And that would be missing the mark. When we focus on the mistake we've made in terms of deed, that's what psychology calls guilt. When we miss that and instead focus on ourselves as being defective or broken, a loser, something like that, and fall into shame, well, it's a very different process. So let me just say this. When we don't mix up the doer with the deed, we actually activate a very positive spiral. It's a spiral of self-improvement that will affect our lives in a proactive, productive way. But far too often, and I want to tie this into addiction, we've been using the word addiction in its Latin root sense to mean enslavement. So way too often in active addiction or enslavement, we, instead of moving into a positive upward spiral, we get locked into a downward vicious cycle. Oftentimes of blaming ourselves, shaming ourselves. And it's this spiral of blame and self-blame and shame, which oftentimes will lead us to even further self-medicate, whether it's with a substance or some other addictive behavior. And then when we do that, it will lead to our feeling worse about who we are. And I think you get how the math goes. It just goes on and on. So we're talking about, on the one hand, a positive adaptive spiral of being able to look at what we've done, missing the mark, and correct it, versus a downward vicious cycle in which we mistake the doer for the deed, blame the doer, shame the doer, and the doer then needs to self-medicate. So for today, what I'd like you to do is to ask you to think of a time in your life where maybe you got trapped in one of these negative cycles of feeling bad about yourself. Again, we're talking about shame. And then that you tried anything possible, even if it was self-defeating. And this is where we start talking about addictive behaviors and enslavement. You tried anything you could to maybe cover over the pain of feeling bad about yourself, maybe tried to mute or blunt the pain. And then I'd like you to reflect on how it is that leads to even worse feelings of ourselves, that is engaging in addictive behaviors, which we typically find self-destructive or self-defeating in the long term, but we need them in the short term just to feel temporary relief from the blame. Can you relate to that? And can you think of a time where you've gotten trapped in negative shame, self-medicated, and then actually created a worse problem? It's a little bit like a tumbleweed that gets going faster and faster. So I want you to take a look at that today. What we'll do is we'll come back to this tomorrow and discuss this further, as we're beginning to get the lay of the land when we talk about shame, making a distinction between shame and guilt. And then we're going to be moving towards ways of reducing and managing our shame so that it not trip us up, especially when it comes to addictive behaviors. Thanks for joining me here today at the Vitality Project. I appreciate that. And I hope you'll come back tomorrow. And in the meantime, please stay safe and be well.